Chapter 7. The Continental System, 1806 to 1807. Economic Warfare and Prussian Destruction. The year 1806 found Napoleon Bonaparte at the height of his power, having crushed Austria at Austerlitz and reshaped the map of Central Europe according to his will. Yet even as he celebrated these victories, the French Emperor understood that his greatest enemy remained unconquered across the English Channel. Britain, protected by the Royal Navy and sustained by global trade networks, continued to finance coalition after coalition against France. Napoleon had abandoned his plans to invade Britain directly after the disaster at Trafalgar, but his brilliant mind was already conceiving a different kind of warfare altogether. If he could not defeat Britain on the battlefield, he would strangle her economically by cutting off the trade that was the lifeblood of her prosperity. This economic strategy would become known as the Continental System, and its enforcement would require Napoleon to bring all of Europe under his control or influence. The idea of economic warfare against Britain was neither new nor original to Napoleon, but his systematic approach to implementing such a blockade was unprecedented in scale and ambition. Previous attempts at trade restrictions had been limited in scope and duration, but Napoleon envisioned nothing less than the complete exclusion of British goods from every port and market in Europe. He understood that Britain's economy depended heavily on exports of manufactured goods to European markets and imports of raw materials from around the world. By closing European markets to British products and preventing British merchants from obtaining continental goods, Napoleon believed he could create unemployment, financial panic, and eventually political revolution in Britain that would force the government to make peace on French terms. The Continental System would officially be proclaimed through the Berlin Decree of November 21, 1806, but its enforcement would require military action against any European power that refused to comply with the blockade. This requirement would bring Napoleon into conflict with Prussia, a kingdom that had remained neutral during the War of the Third Coalition, but was growing increasingly uncomfortable with French dominance in Germany. The story of how this conflict unfolded reveals both Napoleon's military genius at its peak and the beginning of the overextension that would eventually contribute to his downfall. Prussia in 1806 was a kingdom caught between past glory and present reality, ruled by Frederick William III, a well-meaning but indecisive monarch who lacked the iron will of his predecessor, Frederick the Great. The Prussian military system had been revolutionary in the mid-18th century when Frederick the Great used it to defeat much larger enemies and establish Prussia as a major European power. However, by 1806 that same military system had become ossified and outdated, still relying on tactics and organization that had been cutting-edge 50 years earlier, but were now completely inadequate against Napoleon's modern methods of warfare. The Prussian officer corps was dominated by elderly generals who had learned their trade during Frederick's wars and could not adapt to the rapid changes that Napoleon had brought to European battlefields. The Prussian army of 1806 still formed up in the rigid linear formations that Frederick the Great had perfected, with soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in long, thin lines that maximized firepower but offered little flexibility or mobility. This system worked well in the formal set-piece battles of the 18th century, where armies would deploy opposite each other on open ground and fight according to well-established rules and conventions. However, Napoleon's system of warfare emphasized speed, concentration, and the ability to fight multiple separate actions simultaneously while maintaining coordination between different corps. The Prussian generals trained to think in terms of single large battles fought according to predictable patterns, were psychologically and tactically unprepared for the kind of campaign that Napoleon would unleash against them. The decision to go to war with France was not made easily in Berlin, and it reflected the growing anxiety among Prussian leaders about their kingdom's position in the new European order that Napoleon was creating. The formation of the Confederation of the Rhine under French protection had effectively ended the Holy Roman Empire and reduced Austrian influence in Germany to almost nothing. This left Prussia as the only major German power capable of challenging French hegemony, but it also made Prussia a target for Napoleon's next expansion. Many Prussian nobles and military officers believed that war with France was inevitable, and that it would be better to fight while they still had allies than to wait until Napoleon had consolidated his control over all of Europe. The immediate trigger for war came from a series of diplomatic miscalculations and misunderstandings that escalated beyond the point where either side could back down without losing face. Napoleon had been negotiating with Britain about a possible peace settlement, and rumours of these negotiations reached Berlin in a distorted form that suggested France might be willing to return Hanover to British control. Since Prussia had been promised Hanover as compensation for territories lost to France, Prussian leaders interpreted these rumours as evidence that Napoleon was planning to betray them. At the same time, Napoleon learned of secret Prussian military preparations and began to suspect that Prussia was planning to join a new coalition against France. The war party in Berlin was led by Queen Louise, the beautiful and charismatic wife of Frederick William III, who had become convinced that Prussia must fight to preserve its independence and honour. Queen Louise was supported by many young Prussian officers who had grown up hearing stories of Frederick the Great's victories, and believed that Prussian military superiority was a matter of national destiny. These officers were convinced that French successes against Austria and Russia had been due to the weakness and incompetence of those nations' armies, not to any inherent superiority in French military methods. They believed that one decisive battle would be enough to shatter Napoleon's reputation and bring down his empire. The Prussian ultimatum to France was delivered in early October 1806, demanding that French troops withdraw from Germany and that the Confederation of the Rhine be dissolved. This ultimatum was accompanied by the mobilization of the Prussian army and preparations for an immediate invasion of French-controlled territory. Napoleon, who was at the palace of Fontainebleau when he received news of the Prussian ultimatum, reportedly laughed and said that the Prussians were offering him the opportunity to destroy them before Russia could come to their aid. He immediately began concentrating the Grande Armée for a campaign that would settle the German question once and for all. Napoleon's strategic plan for the Prussian campaign was based on his understanding of geography and his enemy's likely intentions. He knew that the main Prussian army was concentrated in Saxony and Thuringia, positioned to either defend Berlin or advance into French territory, depending on circumstances. The key to defeating this army would be to prevent it from retreating toward Berlin, while also cutting its communications with potential Russian reinforcements advancing from the east. Napoleon decided to advance through the Franconian forests with his army concentrated in the famous Bataillon Carré formation, a flexible square of corps that could respond quickly to enemy contact from any direction while maintaining the ability to concentrate superior force at the decisive point. The Grande Armée that advanced into Germany in October 1806 was probably the finest military instrument that had ever existed, the product of years of experience, training, and continuous refinement. The army consisted of 7 corps, each containing between 20 and 30,000 men, and organised as a complete combined arms force with its own infantry, cavalry, artillery, and support services. If necessary, but they were all coordinated through Napoleon's superb staff system to achieve maximum effect when concentrated for covering 25 miles per day, and sometimes more when the situation demanded exceptional effort. The campaign opened on October 8th, 18 terrain of the Franconian forests. Napoleon's intelligence network, one of the most sophisticated in Europe, had provided detailed information in advance with confidence toward their enemy. The Prussian commanders, meanwhile, were operating almost blind, with inadequate reconnaissance. Advantage gave Napoleon a crucial edge that he would exploit ruthlessly throughout the campaign. The first major encounter came on October 10th. To cover the main army's left flank. Louis Ferdinand was a nephew of Frederick the Great and one of the most vocal advocates for war with France. Political opinions. Marshal Lannes attacked the Prussian position with characteristic aggression, and the Prussian corps was quickly overwhelmed and scattered. Shocked the Prussian army and demonstrated that French military superiority was very real. The news of Saalfeld reached the main Prussian helped tip the balance towards retreat. The Prussian generals, suddenly aware that they were facing a much more dangerous enemy than they had anticipated, their scattered forces. This retreat, however, was conducted with the same rigid adherence to outdated procedures that characterized all Prussian altogether for a decisive battle. Napoleon's strategic genius was never more evident than in his ability to coordinate the movements of ability to concentrate them rapidly when the enemy was located. On October 13th, French reconnaissance located the main Prussian army. Napoleon immediately began concentrating his forces for what he expected would be the decisive battle of the campaign, but a series of communication delays and misunderstandings fought simultaneously on the same day. Napoleon himself took personal command of the forces concentrating near Jena, where he believed he would face. In reality, Hohenlohe commanded only about 40,000 men, a substantial force, but not the main Prussian army that Napoleon expected to. They would encounter the real main Prussian army of nearly 60,000 men under the personal command of the Duke of Brunswick, one of the most The simultaneous defeat of two separate enemy armies by forces operating under unified command, but fighting completely independent battles. As Napoleon positioned his artillery on the heights overlooking the Prussian positions in the valley below. The French emperor had spent the previous planning his attack with the meticulous attention to detail that characterized all his great victories. As the sun rose and the morning mist began to clear, Napoleon could see the Prussian army deployed in the traditional linear formations that had been obsolete for at least a decade. The sight must have filled him with confidence, as he knew that his flexible core system and superior artillery would make short work of such rigid deployments. The French attack at Jena was perfectly coordinated, with multiple corps advancing simultaneously against different sections of the Prussian line, while concentrated artillery fire disrupted enemy formations and communications. Napoleon's personal presence on the battlefield inspired his troops to extraordinary efforts, and the combination of superior tactics, better training, and higher morale quickly began to tell. The Prussian line, unable to adapt to the flexible French attacks, began to crack and then collapse as panic spread through the ranks. Prince Hohenlohe, a competent general fighting with an obsolete system, could do nothing to stem the tide of defeat as his army disintegrated under the relentless French assault. 15 miles away at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout was facing a much more dangerous situation with his single corps of 26,000 men against the main Prussian army of nearly 60,000. Davout, one of Napoleon's most capable subordinates, had been advancing through the morning fog when his leading elements encountered Prussian cavalry patrols and quickly realized they were facing a much larger force than expected. Rather than retreating or waiting for reinforcements, Davout made the bold decision to attack immediately, knowing that surprise and aggressive action might compensate for his numerical disadvantage. The Battle of Auerstedt became one of the most remarkable demonstrations of tactical skill and leadership in military history, as Davout's outnumbered corps systematically dismantled a Prussian army more than twice its size. The key to French success was the superior flexibility of their tactical system, which allowed individual battalions and regiments to maneuver independently while maintaining coordination through excellent staff work and communication. The Prussians, locked into their rigid linear formations, could not adapt to the fluid nature of the battle and found themselves repeatedly outflanked and outmaneuvered by smaller French units operating with much greater tactical intelligence. The Duke of Brunswick, commanding the Prussian army at Auerstedt, was mortally wounded early in the battle when a musket ball struck him in the face, leaving the Prussian forces without effective leadership at the crucial moment. King Frederick William III was present with the army, but had no military experience and could not provide the kind of inspirational leadership that might have rallied his demoralized troops. As news of Brunswick's wounding spread through the Prussian ranks, discipline began to collapse, and entire regiments started to flee without orders, creating a panic that no amount of individual courage could overcome. Davout's victory at Auerstedt was achieved through a combination of personal leadership, tactical superiority, and the kind of aggressive initiative that Napoleon had instilled throughout the Grande Armée. The Marshal himself was constantly in the thick of the fighting, rallying his men and directing attacks with a coolness under fire that became legendary throughout the French army. His divisional commanders, men like Generals Gudin and Friant, displayed the same combination of courage and tactical skill that made the French core system so effective. Most importantly, the French soldiers themselves fought with a confidence and flexibility that their Prussian opponents simply could not match. The double victory of Jena-Auerstedt was unprecedented in military history and established Napoleon's reputation as perhaps the greatest tactical commander who had ever lived. Never before had a single army won two major battles on the same day, and the completeness of the Prussian defeat shocked military observers throughout Europe. The Prussian army, which had been considered one of the finest in the world, was not merely defeated but virtually annihilated, losing over 25,000 casualties and most of its artillery and baggage. The French losses in both battles combined totaled fewer than 7,000 men, a casualty ratio that demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of Napoleon's military system. The pursuit after Jena-Auerstedt was conducted with the same relentless efficiency that had characterized the battles themselves, as Napoleon unleashed his cavalry to hunt down the scattered remnants of the Prussian army. Marshal Murat, commanding the French cavalry reserve, led his horsemen in a pursuit that covered hundreds of miles and resulted in the capture of dozens of Prussian generals and thousands of demoralized soldiers. The psychological impact of this pursuit was perhaps even more important than its material results, as it demonstrated that the Prussian military system had completely collapsed and that further resistance was futile. The Prussian fortresses, which had been expected to provide strong points for continued resistance, fell to the French with shocking ease as their demoralized garrisons surrendered without serious fighting. The great fortress of Spandau, which controlled the approaches to Berlin, surrendered to a French sergeant and 30 men who simply demanded its capitulation. Stettin, another major fortress, was taken by a single French regiment, whose commander convinced the Prussian garrison that they were surrounded by Napoleon's entire army. These surrenders, which would have been unthinkable under Frederick the Great, demonstrated how completely the Prussian military spirit had been broken by the disasters of Jena-Auerstedt. Berlin itself fell to the French on October 27th, just 2 weeks after the great battles, and Napoleon entered the Prussian capital in triumph at the head of his victorious army. The sight of French soldiers marching through the streets of Frederick the Great's capital was a powerful symbol of how completely the European balance of power had shifted in favour of France. Napoleon took up residence in the royal palace and issued a series of decrees that effectively placed Prussia under French military occupation while also advancing his broader strategic objectives against Britain. It was from Berlin that Napoleon issued the famous Berlin Decree of November 21st, 1806, which formally established the Continental System and declared Britain to be in a state of blockade. This decree prohibited all trade between Britain and any territory under French control or influence, banned British ships from continental ports, and declared that any British goods found in French-controlled territory would be confiscated. The decree was presented as a response to Britain's naval blockade of French ports, but it represented something much more ambitious: an attempt to wage economic warfare on a continental scale that would force Britain to make peace by destroying her economy. The Continental System represented Napoleon's recognition that military victories alone would not be sufficient to defeat Britain and achieve lasting peace in Europe. Britain's island position and naval supremacy made direct invasion extremely difficult. But the British economy was vulnerable to disruption of trade relationships that had developed over centuries. British manufacturers depended on continental markets for their products. while British consumers had grown accustomed to continental goods like wine, silk, and luxury items that could not be produced domestically. By cutting these trade links, Napoleon hoped to create economic hardship in Britain that would eventually force political change and acceptance of French terms for peace. The enforcement of the Continental System would require Napoleon to extend French control or influence over virtually every port and commercial centre in Europe, a requirement that would drive him into increasingly ambitious military campaigns in the years to come. Spain, Portugal, Austria and Russia would all be drawn into conflict with France primarily because of their refusal to fully implement the trade restrictions that the Continental System demanded. In this sense, the Berlin Decree was not just an economic measure, but a declaration of Napoleon's intention to achieve hegemony over all of Europe in service of his struggle against Britain. The immediate military consequences of the Prussian collapse became apparent as Russian armies began advancing westward to support their defeated ally and potentially continue the war against France. Tsar Alexander I had been slow to mobilize Russian forces for the Fourth Coalition, but the destruction of Prussia meant that Russia would have to fight France alone or accept French dominance in Central Europe. Napoleon, recognizing that his victories in Germany would be meaningless if Russia remained hostile, began preparing for a winter campaign in Poland and East Prussia that would bring him face to face with the formidable Russian army. The Polish campaign that began in late 1806 would test Napoleon's military system in ways that his previous victories had not, as the Grande Armée would have to operate in harsh winter conditions across vast distances with extended supply lines. Poland in 1806 was a geographic expression rather than a unified state, having been partitioned between Prussia, Austria and Russia in the late 18th century. The Polish people, however, retained their national identity and saw Napoleon as a potential liberator who might restore their independence. This popular support would prove crucial during the difficult months ahead, as Polish enthusiasm for the French cause provided both intelligence and logistical support that Napoleon's army desperately needed. The weather during the Polish campaign was some of the worst in living memory, with temperatures dropping far below freezing, and snow making roads virtually impassable for artillery and baggage trains. The French soldiers, accustomed to the relatively mild winters of Western Europe, suffered terribly from the cold and the inadequate shelter available in the poverty-stricken Polish countryside. Disease became as dangerous an enemy as the Russians, with typhus and dysentery taking a heavy toll on French forces throughout the campaign. These conditions would foreshadow the even more catastrophic problems that Napoleon would face during his invasion of Russia 6 years later. The Russian army that Napoleon faced in Poland was very different from the Austrian and Prussian forces he had defeated in previous campaigns, as Russian soldiers were renowned for their toughness, endurance and willingness to fight under the most difficult conditions. The Russian officer corps included capable generals like Bagration and Barclay de Tolly, who understood modern warfare and could adapt their tactics to counter French advantages. Most importantly, the Russian army had learned from previous defeats and had begun to adopt some of the organizational and tactical innovations that made the French system so effective. The Battle of Eylau, fought on February 7th, 1807 in the depths of the Polish winter, would prove to be one of the bloodiest and most inconclusive battles of Napoleon's career. The engagement began almost by accident when advance elements of both armies encountered each other in a blinding snowstorm that made coordination and communication extremely difficult. Napoleon found himself committed to a major battle under conditions that negated many of his tactical advantages, fighting an enemy that was perfectly adapted to the harsh winter environment. The battlefield at Eylau was a nightmare of snow, ice, and freezing temperatures that turned the fighting into an endurance contest between two exhausted and frost-bitten armies. The usual precision of French artillery was compromised by the snow and wind, while the mobility that gave French infantry its tactical edge was severely limited by the difficult ground conditions. The Russian army, fighting on terrain and in weather conditions that were completely familiar to them, proved to be as tough and resilient as their reputation suggested. The battle raged for 2 days without either side achieving a decisive advantage, as attacks and counterattacks surged back and forth across the frozen landscape. Napoleon's personal presence on the battlefield was crucial in maintaining French morale during the darkest moments of the fighting, and his ability to inspire his men under the most difficult conditions demonstrated the leadership qualities that made him so effective as a military commander. At one point during the battle, Napoleon was nearly captured, when Russian cavalry broke through French lines and reached his command position, saved only by the quick reaction of his guard cavalry. The climax of the Battle of Eylau came when Marshal Murat led a massive cavalry charge involving nearly 11,000 horsemen, one of the largest cavalry actions in military history. This charge, conducted across snow-covered ground in sub-zero temperatures, smashed through the centre of the Russian line and prevented what might have been a French defeat. The sight of thousands of French cavalry thundering across the battlefield through the swirling snow became one of the most famous images of the Napoleonic Wars, symbolizing both the glory and the terrible cost of this kind of warfare. When the fighting finally ended, both armies had suffered enormous casualties without either side achieving a clear victory. The French lost approximately 15,000 men, while Russian casualties were even heavier at around 18,000. These losses were particularly devastating because they represented some of the best soldiers in both armies, veterans whose experience and skill could not be easily replaced. For Napoleon, Eylau represented his first battle that could not be claimed as a clear victory, a psychological blow that would affect his reputation for invincibility throughout Europe. The winter quarters following Eylau allowed both armies to rest, refit, and prepare for the spring campaign that would determine the outcome of the war. Napoleon used this period to bring up reinforcements from France and to reorganize his forces for renewed offensive operations. He also intensified his diplomatic efforts to bring new allies into the war against Russia, particularly Turkey and Persia, both of which had their own reasons for opposing Russian expansion. The Continental System became increasingly important during this period, as Napoleon sought to demonstrate to potential allies that France could offer economic benefits as well as military protection. The spring campaign of 1807 culminated in the Battle of Friedland on June 14th, exactly 7 years after Napoleon's victory at Marengo. Friedland would prove to be one of Napoleon's most tactically perfect victories, demonstrating that the French military system remained superior to its opponents, despite the inconclusive result at Eylau. The battle was fought when the Russian army under General Bennigsen made the tactical error of deploying with their backs to the Aller River, giving Napoleon the opportunity to attack them in a position where retreat would be extremely difficult. Napoleon's tactical plan at Friedland was a masterpiece of coordination and timing, as he gradually built up his forces on the battlefield, while concealing his intentions from the enemy. The French attack, when it finally came, was perfectly synchronized across multiple points of the Russian line, with artillery, infantry and cavalry all playing their assigned roles in the destruction of the enemy army. The Russian left wing was completely annihilated when French forces drove it back into the river, where thousands of soldiers drowned or were captured as they tried to escape. The victory at Friedland was so complete that it effectively ended Russian resistance and forced Tsar Alexander I to negotiate for peace. The Russian army lost over 20,000 casualties and most of its artillery, while French losses were relatively light at around 8,000 men. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that Napoleon's tactical genius remained intact despite the difficulties of the winter campaign, and that the French army could still achieve decisive victories against any opponent when properly led and deployed. The negotiations that followed Friedland would result in one of the most dramatic diplomatic encounters of the Napoleonic era, as Napoleon and Tsar Alexander met on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River near the town of Tilsit. This meeting, which took place on June 25, 1807, was carefully choreographed to emphasize the equality of the two emperors and their desire to settle their differences through personal diplomacy rather than continued warfare. The image of the two rulers meeting in the middle of a river, isolated from their armies and advisors, captured the imagination of Europe and became a powerful symbol of the new diplomatic order that Napoleon was creating. The Treaty of Tilsit, signed on July 7, 1807, effectively divided Europe into French and Russian spheres of influence, while committing both powers to enforce the Continental System against Britain. Russia agreed to close its ports to British ships and to join the economic blockade that Napoleon believed would eventually force Britain to make peace. In return, Napoleon recognized Russian control over Finland and gave Alexander a free hand in his conflicts with Turkey. The treaty also created the Duchy of Warsaw from Prussian territories, providing a potential base for the restoration of Polish independence, while also serving as a buffer state between the French and Russian empires. The Continental System that was formalized at Tilsit represented the height of Napoleon's power and influence in Europe, as virtually every major continental nation was now committed to enforcing the trade blockade against Britain. From the Baltic to the Mediterranean, British merchants found themselves excluded from markets that had been crucial to their prosperity for generations. The economic impact was immediate and severe as British exports to Europe dropped dramatically and unemployment began to rise in manufacturing centres throughout England. However, the Continental System also created enormous problems for the European nations that were supposed to enforce it, as the exclusion of British goods created shortages of essential items while also eliminating profitable trade relationships. British manufacturers had developed close relationships with continental customers over many years, and these relationships were not easily replaced by alternative suppliers. French industry, despite Napoleon's efforts to promote it, could not immediately fill the gap left by the exclusion of British products, leading to shortages and higher prices throughout Europe. The enforcement of the Continental System required a level of international cooperation and administrative efficiency that was probably impossible to achieve with the technology and institutions available in the early 19th century. Smuggling became endemic along every coastline and frontier in Europe, as merchants and consumers sought to circumvent the trade restrictions through clandestine networks that proved impossible to completely suppress. British goods continued to reach continental markets through neutral ports, overland routes through Turkey and the Balkans, and direct smuggling operations that were often supported by local officials who profited from the illegal trade. The economic warfare represented by the Continental System was based on sound theoretical principles, but faced practical obstacles that proved insurmountable in the long term. Britain's economy was indeed vulnerable to disruption of continental trade, and the system did cause significant hardship and unemployment in British manufacturing districts. However, Britain's global trading network provided alternative markets in the Americas, India, and other overseas territories that could partially compensate for the loss of European customers. British naval supremacy also allowed them to disrupt French trade while protecting their own shipping, creating economic problems for France that partially offset the advantages of the Continental System. The Continental System ultimately failed because it required Napoleon to maintain political and military control over all of Europe indefinitely, a requirement that led him into increasingly costly and dangerous military commitments. Spain, Portugal, Austria, and eventually Russia would all be drawn into conflict with France, primarily because of disputes over trade policy and the enforcement of the blockade against Britain. These conflicts would eventually exhaust French resources and create the conditions for Napoleon's downfall, making the Continental System both the symbol of his greatest ambitions and one of the primary causes of his ultimate defeat. The period from 1806 to 1807 represented the height of Napoleon's military and political success, as his victories over Prussia and Russia established French hegemony over continental Europe, while the Continental System offered the prospect of defeating Britain through economic means rather than military conquest. The double victory at Jena-Auerstedt had demonstrated French military superiority beyond any doubt, while the Treaty of Tilsit created a diplomatic framework that seemed to guarantee lasting peace and French dominance. However, the seeds of future problems were already visible in the practical difficulties of enforcing the Continental System and the growing resentment of European nations that were forced to sacrifice their economic interests for French strategic objectives. The next phase of Napoleon's career would reveal whether his military genius could overcome the contradictions inherent in his attempt to control all of Europe in service of his struggle against Britain. Chapters 8, 9, the Spanish Ulcer and Wagram campaign, 1808 to 1809. Chapter 8, the Spanish Ulcer, 1808 to 1814. In the autumn of 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the pinnacle of his power, having crushed Austria at Austerlitz, humbled Prussia at Jena-Auerstedt, and forced Russia to become his ally at Tilsit. The Continental System was strangling British trade, and most of Europe bowed to French dominance. Yet it was precisely at this moment of triumph that Napoleon made what many historians consider his greatest strategic blunder, a decision that would ultimately contribute to his downfall and earn the name that would haunt him for the rest of his career, the Spanish Ulcer. The phrase, reportedly coined by Napoleon himself, perfectly captured how this seemingly minor intervention would slowly drain France's strength like an infected wound that refuses to heal. The roots of Napoleon's Spanish adventure lay in his obsession with the Continental System, his economic blockade designed to strangle British commerce by closing European ports to English goods. Portugal, Britain's oldest ally, refused to join the blockade and continued to serve as a vital gateway for British trade into Europe. This defiance infuriated Napoleon, who saw it as a direct challenge to his authority and a threat to his grand strategy for defeating Britain economically, since he could not reach her militarily across the English Channel. To reach Portugal and force compliance with the Continental System, French armies would need to cross Spain, and this requirement set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately consume hundreds of thousands of French lives and resources. Spain in 1808 was ruled by the Bourbon dynasty, specifically King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII. But the real power behind the throne was Manuel Godoy, the corrupt and unpopular favourite of Queen Maria Luisa. The Spanish royal family was deeply dysfunctional, with father and son plotting against each other, while Godoy manipulated both for his own benefit. This internal chaos provided Napoleon with the perfect opportunity to intervene, as he had done so successfully in other European states. Initially, Napoleon had no intention of deposing the Spanish Bourbons entirely, instead planning to use French military presence to pressure Spain into greater cooperation with the Continental System and perhaps to gain some territorial concessions along the Pyrenees border. The French intervention began innocuously enough in October 1807, when Napoleon signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau with Spain, officially allowing French troops to cross Spanish territory to invade Portugal. French Marshal Junot led an army of 25,000 men through Spain and quickly occupied Lisbon, forcing the Portuguese royal family to flee to Brazil under British naval protection. However, Napoleon soon realized that Spanish weakness offered him an opportunity for a much grander prize than simply closing Portuguese ports to British trade. The presence of French troops in Spain, ostensibly as allies, gradually transformed into an occupation as more and more French soldiers crossed the Pyrenees under various pretexts. Napoleon's decision to depose the Spanish Bourbons and install his own brother Joseph as King of Spain represented a fundamental miscalculation that revealed the limits of his political and strategic understanding. Throughout his career, Napoleon had shown remarkable skill at reading the political mood of different populations and adapting his approach accordingly. In Italy, he had successfully presented himself as a liberator, bringing the ideals of the French Revolution to oppressed peoples. In Germany, he had worked with existing rulers and institutions, gradually transforming them to serve French interests. In Poland, he had appealed to nationalist sentiment and dreams of restored independence. However, in Spain, Napoleon completely misread the nature of Spanish society and the depth of Spanish resistance to foreign domination. The Spanish people were united by three powerful forces that Napoleon failed to appreciate: fierce regional pride, deep Catholic faith, and centuries-old hatred of foreign interference. Unlike the Germans or Italians, who were divided into many small states and had experienced frequent foreign rule, the Spanish had been united under one crown for centuries and had developed a strong sense of national identity. Their Catholicism was not the philosophical religion of educated Europeans, but a passionate mystical faith that permeated every aspect of daily life and provided a framework for understanding the world. Most importantly, the Spanish had a long military tradition of irregular warfare dating back to their struggles against the Moors, and they possessed an intimate knowledge of their own rugged terrain that would prove invaluable in the coming conflict. The crisis came to a head in the spring of 1808, when Napoleon summoned both Charles IV and Ferdinand VII to Bayonne, France, ostensibly to mediate their dispute, but actually to force both to abdicate in favour of his brother Joseph. The Spanish people were outraged by this transparent betrayal, and their anger exploded into violence on May 2, 1808, in Madrid. The Dos de Mayo uprising, as it became known, began when Spanish civilians attacked French soldiers in the streets of the capital, using knives, stones, and whatever weapons they could find. The French response was swift and brutal, with General Joachim Murat ordering his troops to shoot anyone found carrying weapons or even suspected of participating in the revolt. The massacre that followed the 2 de Mayo uprising was captured for posterity by the great Spanish artist Francisco Goya in his haunting paintings The 2nd of May and The 3rd of May, which showed French soldiers executing Spanish civilians by firing squad. These images became powerful symbols of Spanish resistance and helped spread the spirit of rebellion throughout the country. More importantly, the brutal French response to civilian resistance established a pattern of violence and reprisal that would characterize the entire Peninsular War and ultimately undermine French attempts to win Spanish hearts and minds. News of the Madrid uprising spread rapidly throughout Spain, igniting rebellions in virtually every major city and province. Unlike previous European conflicts, where resistance had been led by professional armies and traditional elites, the Spanish uprising was genuinely popular, involving people from all social classes, united by their hatred of foreign occupation. Local juntas, or governing councils, formed spontaneously to coordinate resistance efforts, and these bodies immediately began organizing both regular armies and irregular militia forces to fight the French. The Spanish clergy played a crucial role in mobilizing resistance, preaching that the war against the French was a holy crusade to defend Catholic Spain against atheistic invaders who sought to destroy their religion and traditions. The transformation of Spain from a reluctant ally to an occupied territory forced Napoleon to commit far more military resources than he had originally planned. What began as a simple march through Spain to reach Portugal evolved into a massive military occupation requiring hundreds of thousands of French troops to control a hostile population spread across the Iberian Peninsula. This commitment came at precisely the moment when Napoleon faced growing challenges elsewhere in Europe, particularly from Austria, which was preparing for another round of warfare against French domination. The military challenges of fighting in Spain were unlike anything the French army had previously encountered during Napoleon's campaigns. In Germany, Austria and Prussia, battles were typically fought between professional armies on open fields, with clear objectives and decisive results that led to negotiated peace treaties. In Spain, the French faced a completely different kind of warfare that combined regular battles against Spanish armies with constant guerrilla attacks by irregular forces operating throughout occupied territory. This dual nature of the conflict meant that French commanders could never fully control their lines of communication or establish secure bases of operations. Spanish irregular warfare tactics evolved rapidly during the early months of the occupation as local leaders learned through trial and error what methods were most effective against French forces. The guerrilla fighters, as they came to be called from the Spanish word meaning little war, avoided direct confrontation with large French formations, instead preferring to attack isolated detachments, supply convoys and communication lines. They would strike suddenly from concealed positions in mountains or forests, inflict maximum casualties in the shortest possible time, and then disappear before French reinforcements could arrive. This hit-and-run approach was perfectly suited to Spanish terrain, which included vast mountain ranges, dense forests, and countless hidden valleys where guerrilla bands could take refuge. The guerrilla war was incredibly brutal, with both sides committing atrocities that shocked even experienced soldiers accustomed to the violence of 18th-century warfare. Spanish guerrillas often tortured and mutilated French prisoners, sometimes burying them alive or slowly cutting them to pieces while forcing their comrades to watch. French soldiers responded with equal savagery, burning entire villages suspected of harbouring guerrillas, executing civilians without trial, and implementing policies of collective punishment that only increased Spanish hatred and resistance. This cycle of violence and revenge created an atmosphere of terror that made normal military operations almost impossible, and forced the French to devote enormous resources simply to protecting their own forces. French attempts to adapt to unconventional warfare revealed both the strengths and limitations of Napoleon's military system. The Grande Armée had been designed for rapid movement and decisive battles against conventional enemies, not for the patient work of counterinsurgency operations in hostile territory. French officers, trained in the traditions of European warfare, struggled to develop effective tactics against an enemy that refused to fight according to established rules. Some commanders like Marshal Suchet in Aragon showed considerable skill in adapting to Spanish conditions by combining military pressure with political concessions and economic incentives. Others, like Marshal Soult in Andalusia, relied primarily on brute force and terror, achieving temporary control but never eliminating the sources of resistance. The arrival of British forces under Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, transformed the Peninsular War from a colonial-style insurgency into a major European conflict. British involvement had always been likely given the traditional Anglo-Portuguese alliance and Britain's interest in opening a new front against French power. But Wellington's successful landing in Portugal and his subsequent victories against French forces demonstrated that Napoleon's armies were not invincible. The British brought professional military leadership, modern equipment, and most importantly, naval supremacy that allowed them to supply their forces and evacuate them if necessary, without depending on overland communications that guerrillas could disrupt. Wellington's strategic approach to the Peninsular War was masterful in its combination of conventional military operations with support for Spanish irregular forces. Rather than attempting to liberate all of Spain immediately, Wellington focused on establishing a secure base in Portugal while gradually expanding British influence and supporting Spanish resistance efforts throughout the peninsula. His defensive strategy relied on superior British infantry discipline and firepower to defeat French attacks, while his offensive operations were carefully planned to exploit French weaknesses and avoid unnecessary risks. This patient approach frustrated French commanders who were accustomed to rapid, decisive campaigns, but proved perfectly suited to the unique conditions of the Iberian Peninsula. The Siege of Saragossa became one of the most famous episodes of the entire Peninsular War, demonstrating both the determination of Spanish resistance and the horror of urban warfare in the age of Napoleon. The city, located on the Ebro River in northeastern Spain, was attacked twice by French forces, first in the summer of 1808 and again in the winter of 1808 to 1809. During both sieges, the civilian population fought alongside Spanish soldiers in defending every street, every building, and every room against French assault troops. Women and children carried ammunition, built barricades, and even fought with weapons when necessary, creating a level of popular resistance that amazed and horrified French officers who had never encountered anything like it in their previous campaigns. The First Siege of Saragossa lasted from June to August 1808 and ended with the French withdrawal after suffering heavy casualties in street fighting. The Spanish defence was led by José de Palafox, a charismatic general who inspired the population to extraordinary acts of heroism and sacrifice. Stories spread throughout Europe of Spanish civilians fighting with kitchen knives and farm tools, of women loading cannons while their husbands fell beside them, and of children as young as 10 years old carrying messages through enemy fire. These tales, whether entirely accurate or not, became powerful propaganda tools that helped maintain Spanish morale and encouraged other European peoples to resist French domination. The Second Siege of Saragossa, which lasted from December 1808 to February 1809, was even more devastating than the first. French forces under Marshal Lannes used artillery and sappers to systematically destroy the city's defences, but Spanish resistance continued even after the outer walls were breached. Fighting moved from street to street and house to house, with Spanish defenders using every possible position to slow the French advance. Churches, convents and private homes became fortresses, and French soldiers had to clear each building room by room in fighting that resembled the worst urban combat of later centuries. The human cost of the Saragossa sieges was appalling, with estimates suggesting that over 50,000 Spanish civilians and soldiers died defending their city, while French casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Disease and starvation killed as many people as enemy fire, and the final surrender came only after the city had been reduced to rubble and most of its population was dead or dying. The French victory was complete but Pyrrhic, as the resources required to capture Saragossa could have been used for other military operations, and the international attention focused on Spanish suffering increased European opposition to French expansion. The Battle of Baylen in July 1808 marked a crucial turning point in the Peninsular War and dealt a severe blow to French military prestige throughout Europe. General Pierre Dupont, leading a French army of about 20,000 men towards Seville in southern Spain, was surrounded and forced to surrender by Spanish forces under General Francisco Castaños. This was the first time in the Napoleonic Wars that an entire French army had surrendered to conventional enemy forces, and the psychological impact was enormous. News of Baylen spread rapidly throughout Europe, encouraging Austrian and Prussian patriots to believe that French armies could be defeated and inspiring renewed resistance to Napoleonic hegemony. The circumstances of the Baylen defeat revealed several important weaknesses in French military operations in Spain. Dupont's army was relatively small and isolated, operating far from its supply bases and without adequate intelligence about enemy movements or strength. The Spanish forces that surrounded him were better led and more numerous than French commanders had expected, demonstrating that Spanish military capabilities had been seriously underestimated. Most importantly, the local population actively supported Spanish forces while hindering French operations, providing intelligence, supplies and recruits while denying the same assistance to the invaders. Napoleon's personal intervention in Spain during the winter of 1808 to 1809 represented his last serious attempt to resolve the Spanish problem through decisive military action. Bringing veteran troops from the Grande Armée and assuming personal command of operations, Napoleon hoped to crush Spanish resistance and establish French control so firmly that he could withdraw most of his forces for use elsewhere in Europe. His campaign was initially successful, with French forces winning several battles and occupying Madrid, but Napoleon was forced to return to France after only 4 months due to the growing Austrian threat in Central Europe. During his brief Spanish campaign, Napoleon demonstrated his continued tactical brilliance while also revealing his failure to understand the true nature of Spanish resistance. His victories at battles like Somosierra, where Polish lancers charged uphill to capture Spanish artillery positions, showed that French military superiority remained intact when facing conventional Spanish armies. However, these tactical successes did nothing to address the fundamental problem of governing a hostile population that refused to accept French rule. Napoleon's political attempts to win Spanish support through legal reforms, religious tolerance, and economic development failed completely because they were imposed by foreign conquerors rather than arising from Spanish desires for change. The long-term occupation of Spain became an enormous drain on French military and economic resources that Napoleon could not afford, given his other European commitments. At any given time during the Peninsular War, France had between 200 and 300,000 troops in Spain and Portugal, representing a significant portion of the total French army. These forces required constant supplies of food, ammunition, equipment and reinforcements, all of which had to be transported across the Pyrenees through territory where guerrilla attacks made every convoy a dangerous expedition. The financial cost of maintaining such a large army in hostile territory was staggering, contributing to the economic problems that would plague Napoleon's later campaigns. The impact of the Peninsular War extended far beyond the Iberian Peninsula itself, influencing military development, political thought, and national consciousness throughout Europe and the Americas. The success of Spanish guerrilla warfare inspired similar resistance movements in other countries occupied by French forces, particularly in Germany and Italy, where patriotic societies began organizing to support future uprisings against Napoleonic rule. The brutal nature of the Spanish conflict also contributed to a hardening of attitudes toward war itself, as the idealistic phase of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars gave way to a more realistic understanding of the costs and consequences of military conquest. Wellington's successful defensive strategy in Portugal, centred around the lines of Torres Vedras, demonstrated new approaches to military engineering and strategic planning that would influence warfare for decades to come. The lines consisted of 3 successive defensive positions stretching across the Portuguese peninsula north of Lisbon, each incorporating natural terrain features enhanced by extensive fortifications, obstacles, and communications systems. When French forces under Marshal Massena invaded Portugal in 1810, they found their advance blocked by defensive works that were virtually impregnable and protected by a hostile population that had been evacuated along with all supplies that might benefit the invaders. The development of light infantry and skirmisher tactics during the Peninsular War represented a significant evolution in military doctrine that reflected the changing nature of warfare itself. Traditional 18th century tactics had emphasized tight formations, disciplined volleys, and the decisive shock of massed assault, but Spanish conditions required greater flexibility and individual initiative. British rifle regiments, Portuguese cacadores, and Spanish guerrilla fighters all contributed to the development of new tactics that emphasized marksmanship, individual movement, and the ability to fight effectively in broken terrain where traditional formations would be vulnerable. The influence of the Spanish resistance on Latin American independence movements was profound and immediate, as news of the Peninsular Uprising inspired colonial revolutionaries to believe that Spanish power could be successfully challenged. When Napoleon deposed Ferdinand VII and installed Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain, many Spanish colonists in the Americas refused to recognize the new government and began organizing their own governing councils, similar to those that had emerged in Spain itself. Leaders like Simon Bolivar and José de San Martin drew inspiration from Spanish guerrilla tactics and the example of popular resistance to foreign domination, adapting these lessons to their own struggles for independence. The guerrilla warfare tactics developed during the Peninsular War became a model for irregular forces throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, influencing conflicts from the American Civil War to the wars of decolonization in Asia and Africa. Spanish guerrilla leaders like Juan Martín Díez, known as El Empecinado, and Francisco Espoz developed techniques for organizing civilian populations, coordinating attacks on enemy communications, and maintaining resistance movements despite superior enemy force that would be studied and imitated by later generations of irregular fighters. French counterinsurgency methods in Spain revealed both the potential effectiveness and ultimate limitations of military responses to popular resistance movements. Some French commanders achieved temporary success through combinations of military pressure, political concessions, and economic incentives, but these gains were usually lost as soon as French attention turned elsewhere or local circumstances changed. The French discovery that conventional military superiority was insufficient to control a hostile population foreshadowed similar challenges that would face other imperial powers in later centuries when confronting nationalist or revolutionary movements. Chapter 9. The Wagram Campaign, 1809. While Napoleon struggled with the endless complexities of Spanish resistance, a far more immediate and dangerous threat was developing in Central Europe, as Austria prepared for what would become known as the War of the Fifth Coalition. The timing of Austrian preparations was not coincidental, as Habsburg strategists had carefully observed French difficulties in Spain and concluded that Napoleon's empire was overextended and vulnerable to attack. The Austrian decision to resume hostilities in 1809 represented a calculated gamble that French resources were stretched too thin to allow for effective response to a major European war, while simultaneously maintaining the enormous military commitment required to control Spain. Austria's military reforms under Archduke Charles had been proceeding steadily since the disasters of 1805, when Austrian forces had been decisively defeated at Austerlitz and forced to accept humiliating peace terms. Charles, widely regarded as the most competent military commander in Austrian service, had spent the intervening years reorganizing the Habsburg army along lines that borrowed heavily from French innovations while maintaining distinctly Austrian characteristics. The reforms included improved training methods, better coordination between different branches of service, enhanced artillery capabilities, and most importantly, the development of tactical flexibility that would allow Austrian forces to respond more effectively to Napoleon's rapid maneuvers and concentrated attacks. The Austrian military transformation was supported by significant British financial assistance as the island kingdom continued its policy of subsidizing any European power willing to fight against French dominance. British gold allowed Austria to purchase modern equipment, hire additional troops, and maintain larger armies in the field than would have been possible using Austrian resources alone. More importantly, British diplomatic support helped convince Austrian leaders that they would not face French power alone, as coordination with other potential enemies of Napoleon could create multiple threats that would divide French attention and resources. The timing of the Austrian attack in April 1809 was carefully calculated to exploit Napoleon's absence in Spain and the commitment of veteran French troops to the Peninsular War. Austrian intelligence had correctly identified that many of the Grande Armée's most experienced units were fighting in Spain, leaving Central Europe defended primarily by newer formations with less combat experience and fewer veteran officers. Habsburg strategists hoped to achieve rapid initial successes that would encourage other German states to join an anti-French coalition and possibly even inspire rebellions within the French Empire itself. The Austrian invasion of Bavaria in April 1809 caught French forces somewhat off guard, as Napoleon had been hoping to resolve the Spanish situation before facing another major European war. However, the Emperor's response demonstrated the continued effectiveness of his strategic planning and organizational abilities, as he rapidly transferred himself and significant reinforcements from Spain to Germany, while coordinating French resistance to the Austrian advance. The speed of Napoleon's mobilization from Spain to Austria was remarkable even by his own standards, as he managed to travel from Valladolid to the Danube in less than 2 weeks, while simultaneously directing the movement of multiple army corps across hundreds of miles of European territory. The Danube campaign of 1809 began with a series of complex maneuvers as both sides attempted to gain tactical and strategic advantages through superior positioning and concentration of force. Austrian forces under Archduke Charles initially achieved some success by advancing into Bavaria before French reinforcements could arrive in sufficient numbers, but Napoleon's personal arrival transformed the strategic situation by providing the kind of coordinated leadership that French forces had been lacking. The Emperor's ability to quickly assess the tactical situation and develop appropriate responses demonstrated that his military genius remained intact despite the frustrations and distractions of the Spanish conflict. The Battle of Eckmühl on April 22, 1809, marked Napoleon's return to the kind of decisive warfare that had made him famous during his earlier campaigns. French forces, operating with their characteristic speed and coordination, managed to separate Austrian armies and defeat them in detail before they could combine their strength for a coordinated defence. Napoleon's tactical handling of the battle showed his continued mastery of the principles that had served him so well in previous conflicts: rapid concentration of superior force at the decisive point, coordination between different branches of service, and the psychological impact of personal leadership on both French and enemy troops. The French advance on Vienna following the victory at Eckmühl demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Napoleonic strategic methods and the changing nature of European warfare as nationalist sentiment began to influence military operations. Unlike 1805, when the capture of the Austrian capital had been primarily a matter of military and diplomatic prestige, the 1809 occupation of Vienna took place in the context of growing German nationalism that gave political significance to every territorial gain or loss. Austrian resistance was more determined than in previous conflicts, and the civilian population showed greater hostility to French occupation, reflecting the spread of national consciousness that the Napoleonic Wars themselves had helped to create. Napoleon's first crossing of the Danube River in May 1809 resulted in the Battle of Aspern-Essling, which became the first clear tactical defeat that Napoleon had suffered on a European battlefield during his career as emperor. The Austrian forces under Archduke Charles had positioned themselves advantageously on the north bank of the Danube, and had prepared defensive positions that maximized their strengths while minimizing French advantages in mobility and coordination. When Napoleon attempted to force a crossing with inadequate preparation and insufficient forces, Austrian resistance proved more effective than he had anticipated. The Battle of Aspern-Essling on May 21st, 1809, demonstrated several important lessons about the evolution of warfare during the Napoleonic period and the growing sophistication of Austrian military doctrine. Archduke Charles had carefully studied French tactical methods and had developed countermeasures that exploited the weaknesses inherent in Napoleon's usual approaches to battle. Austrian forces showed improved discipline and coordination, maintaining their formations under pressure and executing complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for Habsburg armies in earlier campaigns. Most importantly, Austrian artillery had been significantly improved and was able to match French guns in both quantity and quality, eliminating one of Napoleon's traditional advantages. The death of Marshal Jean Lannes during the Battle of Aspern-Essling had a profound emotional impact on Napoleon that went far beyond the simple loss of a capable subordinate commander. Lannes had been one of Napoleon's closest friends since the early days of the Italian campaigns, and his death from wounds suffered during the Austrian artillery bombardment represented a personal tragedy that affected the emperor's mood and judgment for months afterward. Napoleon's reaction to Lannes' death, including his extended vigil at the marshal's bedside and his obvious grief at the funeral, revealed the human side of a man who was often seen as coldly calculating and emotionally distant from the sufferings that his ambitions had caused. The lessons of Aspern-Essling forced Napoleon to reconsider his tactical approaches and to develop new methods for dealing with enemies who had learned to counter his traditional strategies. The defeat demonstrated that Austrian military reforms had been more successful than French intelligence had realized, and that Habsburg forces could no longer be dismissed as incompetent relics of an earlier military era. Napoleon's response to this challenge showed both his intellectual flexibility and his determination to maintain French military superiority through innovation and adaptation, rather than simply repeating tactics that had worked in previous campaigns. The preparation for the Battle of Wagram during June and July 1809 represented one of the most thorough and systematic military planning efforts of Napoleon's entire career. Learning from the mistakes that had led to defeat at Aspern-Essling, the emperor devoted enormous attention to logistics, intelligence gathering, and tactical preparation for what he understood would be a decisive battle that could determine the outcome of the entire Austrian campaign. The concentration of French forces for the Wagram battle required complex coordination of multiple army corps from different parts of Europe, demonstrating the continued effectiveness of Napoleon's organizational methods when applied with sufficient care and attention to detail. The Battle of Wagram, fought on July 5th, 1809, became famous primarily for Napoleon's use of massive artillery concentrations to break Austrian resistance and create opportunities for infantry and cavalry attacks. The Grand Battery assembled for this battle represented the largest concentration of artillery that had ever been used in European warfare up to that time, with over 100 guns firing coordinated barrages that devastated Austrian positions and demoralized Habsburg troops. This tactical innovation reflected Napoleon's understanding that military technology and firepower were becoming increasingly important factors in determining battle outcomes, supplementing but not replacing the traditional emphasis on maneuver and morale. The technical aspects of artillery coordination at Wagram required unprecedented levels of planning and execution, as French gunners had to coordinate their fire not only with each other, but also with advancing infantry formations that needed artillery support without being endangered by friendly fire. The positioning of guns, calculation of ranges and trajectories, and timing of barrages all had to be precisely managed to achieve maximum effectiveness while minimizing the risk to French troops. This level of technical sophistication demonstrated how far military science had advanced since the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, and foreshadowed the even greater emphasis on firepower that would characterize later 19th century warfare. General MacDonald's column attack during the Battle of Wagram represented another tactical innovation that showed Napoleon's continued ability to develop new methods for achieving battlefield success. The massive infantry column that MacDonald led against the Austrian centre was larger and more concentrated than similar formations used in earlier battles, and its success demonstrated the continued effectiveness of shock tactics when properly supported by artillery and cavalry. However, the heavy casualties suffered by MacDonald's column also revealed the increasing deadliness of defensive firepower and foreshadowed the tactical challenges that would eventually make such frontal assaults prohibitively expensive. The strategic victory achieved at Wagram came at a significant cost in both casualties and resources, reflecting the changing nature of Napoleonic warfare as enemies became more capable and battles became more evenly matched. French losses at Wagram were substantial, and the victory was not as decisive as Napoleon's earlier triumphs at Austerlitz or Jena-Auerstedt. Austrian forces, while defeated, were not destroyed and continued to pose a significant threat even after their withdrawal from the battlefield. This pattern of costly victories that failed to achieve complete destruction of enemy forces would become increasingly common during Napoleon's later campaigns, as his opponents learned to minimize their losses and preserve their armies for future operations. The Treaty of Schönbrunn, signed in October 1809, reflected both Napoleon's continued dominance in Central Europe and the growing limitations of what military victory alone could achieve in the face of nationalist resistance and coalition warfare. Austria lost additional territory, including access to the sea, through the cession of coastal provinces to France and its allies, and was forced to pay massive indemnities that would cripple Habsburg finances for years to come. However, the Austrian state survived intact, and Austrian military capabilities remained formidable despite their defeat, ensuring that the Habsburg Empire would continue to pose a potential threat to French hegemony in future conflicts. Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria in 1810 represented both a diplomatic masterstroke and a personal tragedy that revealed the extent to which political considerations dominated every aspect of his life. The marriage alliance with the Habsburg dynasty was designed to legitimize Napoleon's imperial status by connecting him to one of Europe's oldest ruling families, while also creating dynastic ties that might discourage future Austrian hostility to French interests. However, the marriage required Napoleon to divorce Josephine, the woman he genuinely loved, creating personal anguish that affected his emotional well-being and may have influenced his judgment during subsequent crises. The integration of Austrian military techniques into French practice following the Wagram campaign demonstrated Napoleon's continued willingness to learn from his enemies and to adopt innovations that could improve French military effectiveness. Austrian developments in artillery organization, staff work and defensive tactics were carefully studied and selectively incorporated into French doctrine, while Austrian officers who had distinguished themselves during the campaign were sometimes offered positions in French service. This intellectual flexibility and openness to new ideas had been one of Napoleon's greatest strengths throughout his career, and continued to serve him well even as his strategic position became increasingly difficult. The strengthening of Continental System enforcement following the Austrian defeat of 1809 represented Napoleon's continued belief that economic warfare could ultimately defeat Britain even if direct military confrontation remained impossible. The acquisition of additional Austrian territory and the tightening of control over German states provided new opportunities to restrict British trade and to enforce compliance with French economic policies. However, the effectiveness of the Continental System remained limited by smuggling, non-compliance by reluctant allies, and the fundamental economic needs of European populations for goods that could only be obtained through trade with Britain or its colonies. The artillery innovations demonstrated at Wagram had profound implications for the future development of military technology and tactics, influencing warfare throughout the 19th century and beyond. The concept of the Grand Battery would be refined and expanded by later military thinkers, leading to the massive artillery concentrations that would characterize the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War, and ultimately the world wars of the 20th century. Napoleon's emphasis on coordinating artillery fire with infantry advances also foreshadowed the combined arms tactics that would become standard practice in modern military operations. The technical analysis of Napoleon's artillery methods at Wagram reveals the sophisticated understanding of ballistics, logistics, and battlefield coordination that French military engineers had developed during years of constant warfare. The positioning of guns to achieve converging fields of fire, the calculation of trajectories to maximize effectiveness against specific targets, and the timing of barrages to support infantry movements all required mathematical precision and technical expertise that represented the cutting edge of early 19th century military science. These developments marked a crucial transition from the relatively simple artillery tactics of earlier periods to the complex fire support systems that would dominate later warfare. The comparison between Napoleon's artillery tactics at Wagram and his methods in earlier campaigns reveals both continuity and evolution in his approach to military technology. While the basic principles of concentrating firepower at decisive points remained constant, the scale and sophistication of artillery operations had increased dramatically since battles like Austerlitz and Jena-Auerstedt. This evolution reflected both technological improvements in gun design and ammunition, and Napoleon's growing understanding of how to maximize the effectiveness of artillery in different tactical situations. The influence of Wagram on later 19th century artillery development can be traced through the military literature and doctrinal writings of subsequent decades, as military theorists and practitioners studied Napoleon's methods and attempted to apply his innovations to their own situations. The Prussian military reforms that followed the Napoleonic Wars incorporated many lessons learned from French artillery tactics, while American artillery officers during the Civil War explicitly referenced Napoleonic precedents when developing their own battlefield techniques. This intellectual legacy ensured that Napoleon's contributions to military science would continue to influence warfare long after his political power had ended. The Wagram campaign, taken as a whole, demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Napoleonic military methods and the growing challenges that Napoleon faced as his enemies learned to counter his strategies and as the political environment of Europe became increasingly hostile to French expansion. While Napoleon had achieved another tactical victory and maintained French dominance in Central Europe, the campaign had required enormous resources and had failed to eliminate Austrian military capabilities or resolve the fundamental strategic problems facing the French Empire. The pattern of costly victories against increasingly capable enemies would continue to characterize Napoleon's later campaigns, ultimately contributing to the exhaustion and overextension that would lead to his downfall. Chapter 10. The Russian Gamble, 1812, the Grande Armée's destruction. By the year 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte stood at the absolute peak of his power, ruling over an empire that stretched from Spain to Poland and from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. Yet beneath this facade of invincibility, cracks were beginning to show in the Continental System that he had worked so hard to create. The emperor, who had conquered Austria, Prussia, and most of Europe, now faced his greatest challenge in the form of Tsar Alexander I of Russia, a ruler who had once been his ally, but was now becoming his most dangerous enemy. The seeds of the Russian campaign that would ultimately destroy the Grande Armée had been planted years earlier in the shifting sands of European diplomacy and economics. The Continental System, Napoleon's grand strategy to defeat Britain through economic warfare, had been the cornerstone of his European policy since the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. This system was designed to close all European ports to British goods, thereby strangling British trade and forcing the island nation to sue for peace. However, the Continental System created enormous economic hardships for European nations, including Russia, which had traditionally enjoyed profitable trade relationships with Britain. Russian merchants found themselves cut off from lucrative markets for their grain, timber, and other raw materials, while Russian consumers faced shortages of colonial goods like sugar, coffee, and cotton textiles that had previously been imported through British trade networks. Tsar Alexander I, who had initially agreed to support the Continental System as part of his alliance with Napoleon, found himself under increasing pressure from Russian nobles and merchants who were suffering financially from the trade embargo. By 1810, Russia had begun allowing neutral ships to enter Russian ports, effectively creating loopholes in the Continental System that allowed British goods to reach European markets through Russian intermediaries. Napoleon viewed these violations as direct challenges to his authority and threats to his entire strategy for defeating Britain. The Emperor's spies reported that British-manufactured goods were flowing freely through Russian ports, undermining the economic pressure that was supposed to force Britain to negotiate. When Napoleon confronted Alexander about these violations, the Tsar claimed that Russia needed to trade with neutral nations for economic survival, but Napoleon saw this as betrayal of their alliance and evidence that Russia could no longer be trusted as a reliable partner. The Polish question added another layer of complexity to the deteriorating relationship between France and Russia. Poland had been partitioned between Russia, Prussia and Austria in the late 18th century, but Napoleon had recreated a Polish state in the form of the Duchy of Warsaw after his victories over Prussia and Austria. Many Poles looked to Napoleon as their liberator and hoped that he would eventually restore Poland to its full historical boundaries, which would require taking territory away from Russia. Alexander I was deeply concerned about Polish nationalism and the possibility that Napoleon might encourage Polish rebellions in the Russian-controlled portions of former Poland. The Tsar also worried that a strong independent Poland allied with France would create a permanent threat to Russian security on its western border. Personal animosity between Napoleon and Alexander I played a significant role in the breakdown of their relationship. The two emperors had met face to face at Tilsit in 1807 and had appeared to develop a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared ambitions. However, their personalities and governing styles were fundamentally different, and the honeymoon period of their alliance could not survive the pressures of competing national interests. Napoleon was impulsive, decisive, and accustomed to getting his way through force or intimidation, while Alexander was more cautious, diplomatic, and sensitive to the opinions of his court and nobles. Napoleon increasingly saw Alexander as weak and unreliable, while Alexander came to view Napoleon as an arrogant tyrant who could not be trusted to honour his agreements. The diplomatic tensions between France and Russia escalated throughout 1811 and early 1812 as both sides began preparing for what seemed to be an inevitable conflict. Napoleon demanded that Russia strictly enforce the Continental System and provide guarantees that Polish territory would not be threatened by Russian expansion. Alexander, meanwhile, insisted that Russia had the right to trade with neutral nations, and that Polish nationalism posed a legitimate security concern that needed to be addressed. Neither emperor was willing to make the compromises necessary to preserve their alliance, and both began to see war as the only way to resolve their differences decisively. Napoleon's decision to invade Russia was also driven by his need to maintain his dominant position in Europe through continued military success. The emperor understood that his power ultimately rested on his reputation as an invincible military commander, and any sign of weakness or indecision could encourage his enemies to form new coalitions against him. Britain was already providing financial support to any nation willing to fight against France, and Napoleon knew that a successful Russian campaign would eliminate the last major continental power capable of challenging French hegemony. If he could defeat Russia decisively, as he had defeated Austria and Prussia, then Britain would be completely isolated and forced to accept a negotiated peace on Napoleon's terms. The massive military preparation for the Russian campaign began in earnest during the winter of 1811 to 1812, as Napoleon assembled what would become the largest army in European history up to that point. The Grande Armée that crossed into Russia in June 1812 numbered approximately 615,000 men, drawn from across the French Empire and its allied and vassal states. This enormous force included not only French troops, but also Germans from the Confederation of the Rhine, Italians from the Kingdom of Italy, Poles from the Duchy of Warsaw, Austrians who were technically French allies, and even Prussians who were forced to contribute troops as part of their post-war obligations to France. The logistics of supplying such a massive army over the vast distances of European Russia presented unprecedented challenges that would ultimately contribute to the campaign's failure. Napoleon's quartermaster general Pierre Daru worked tirelessly to organize supply depots, transportation networks and administrative systems capable of supporting 600,000 men and their horses across hundreds of miles of enemy territory. The army required approximately 2,500 tons of food and fodder every single day, not including ammunition, medical supplies and other military necessities. Traditional military wisdom suggested that armies should live off the land through foraging. But the sparse population and limited agricultural resources of Western Russia made this approach inadequate for such a large force. Napoleon ordered the construction of massive supply bases in Poland and East Prussia, where enormous quantities of grain, meat, brandy, and other supplies were stockpiled in preparation for the invasion. The emperor also assembled the largest wagon train in military history, consisting of nearly 26,000 supply wagons pulled by horses and oxen. However, even this massive logistical effort was insufficient for the scale of the operation Napoleon was planning. The supply wagons could carry only enough food for a few days of operations, and the army would quickly outrun its supply lines once it advanced deep into Russian territory. The multinational composition of the Grande Armée created additional challenges for command and control that would become apparent during the campaign. While Napoleon was unquestionably one of history's greatest military leaders, his system of command had been developed for leading French armies with shared language, culture, and military traditions. The polyglot army of 1812 included soldiers who spoke dozens of different languages and came from military traditions that varied significantly in their approaches to discipline, tactics, and logistics. German troops were generally well disciplined and reliable, but they lacked the enthusiasm and revolutionary fervour that had characterised French armies in earlier campaigns. Polish troops were highly motivated by their desire for independence, but they were often poorly equipped and inadequately trained. Austrian and Prussian contingents were fighting alongside their former enemies and could not be entirely trusted to fight with maximum effort against Russia. Intelligence gathering and diplomatic preparation for the Russian campaign revealed the enormous challenges that Napoleon would face in fighting a war across such vast distances. French spies reported that Russia had been strengthening its military forces and improving its defensive preparations since the breakdown of the Franco-Russian alliance. The Russian army had learned valuable lessons from its earlier defeats at Austerlitz and Friedland, and new commanders like Mikhail Kutuzov had emerged who understood how to fight effectively against Napoleonic tactics. Russian diplomats were also working to secure support from Britain and other European powers, ensuring that France would face a multi-front war if the Russian campaign became prolonged. Napoleon's diplomatic efforts before the invasion focused on securing the neutrality or support of key European powers and preventing the formation of a new anti-French coalition. The emperor negotiated agreements with Austria and Prussia that required these former enemies to provide military support for the Russian campaign, though he understood that their commitment would be limited and unreliable. He also worked to maintain French control over Spain and secure the Italian frontier, ensuring that French forces would not be needed in large numbers outside of the main theatre of operations. However, Napoleon's diplomatic position was fundamentally weakened by the unpopularity of French rule throughout Europe and the growing strength of nationalist movements that opposed foreign domination. The invasion of Russia began on June 24, 1812, when the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River at multiple points and advanced into Russian territory. Napoleon had chosen to begin the campaign in midsummer to take advantage of the best weather and road conditions. But even this seemingly favourable timing would prove problematic, as the army struggled with heat, dust and limited water supplies during the initial advance. The emperor's strategy called for a rapid advance to bring the Russian army to battle as quickly as possible, following the pattern of his earlier campaigns where decisive victories had been achieved within weeks or months of the opening of hostilities. However, the Russians had prepared a very different kind of campaign than Napoleon expected, based on their understanding of their own strategic advantages and the weaknesses of the French position. Rather than standing and fighting major battles near the frontier, the Russian commanders implemented a strategy of gradual withdrawal that would draw the French army deeper into Russian territory while avoiding the kind of decisive engagement that had destroyed Austrian and Prussian armies in previous wars. This strategy took advantage of Russia's enormous geographic depth and sparse population, making it difficult for the French to live off the land or establish secure supply lines. The Russian retreat was not simply a matter of running away from the French advance, but rather a carefully planned strategic withdrawal that maximized the difficulties facing Napoleon's army while preserving Russian military strength for a later counter-offensive. Russian commanders destroyed bridges, burned villages, and removed or destroyed food supplies that might be useful to the advancing French forces. This scorched earth strategy was psychologically difficult for Russian officers and soldiers who were abandoning their own territory to foreign invaders, but it was militarily sound given the enormous size of the French army and the limitations of Napoleon's logistical system. The appointment of Mikhail Kutuzov as commander-in-chief of the Russian army in August 1812 marked a turning point in Russian strategy and morale. Kutuzov was a veteran general who had fought against Napoleon at Austerlitz and understood both the strengths and limitations of French military methods. Unlike younger Russian generals who were eager to fight major battles, Kutuzov had the strategic patience necessary to implement a long-term plan for defeating the Grande Armée through attrition rather than direct confrontation. Kutuzov's appointment was popular with Russian soldiers who saw him as a genuinely Russian commander rather than one of the foreign-born generals who had previously led Russian armies to defeat. As the French army advanced deeper into Russia during July and August 1812, Napoleon began to realize that his usual tactics were not producing the desired results. Previous campaigns had been decided by one or two major battles fought within a few hundred miles of the French frontier, but the Russian army continued to retreat without offering the kind of decisive engagement that Napoleon needed to win quickly. The Grande Armée was already beginning to suffer significant losses from disease, desertion, and exhaustion, even before any major battles had been fought. Heat, dust, and contaminated water supplies caused widespread illness among the troops, while the constant marching over poor roads wore out both men and horses. The supply situation became increasingly desperate as the army advanced beyond the range of its supply wagons and found little food or fodder available in the sparsely populated Russian countryside. Napoleon had expected to be able to feed his army through foraging, as he had done successfully in the rich agricultural regions of Central Europe, but Western Russia could not support such a large force. Villages were small and poor, with limited food supplies that had often been destroyed by the retreating Russians. The army's horses began dying in large numbers from exhaustion and lack of fodder, reducing the effectiveness of French cavalry and artillery units that depended on horse-drawn transportation. By September 1812, Napoleon faced a strategic dilemma that would ultimately determine the fate of his entire empire. The Grande Armée had advanced more than 400 miles into Russian territory and had captured several important cities, but the Russian army remained intact and continued to retreat eastward. Napoleon could continue advancing toward Moscow in hopes of forcing a decisive battle or capturing the ancient Russian capital. But this would extend his supply lines even further and risk being caught by winter weather deep in enemy territory. Alternatively, he could halt the advance and attempt to establish secure winter quarters in occupied Russian territory, but this would abandon his goal of achieving a quick, decisive victory and give the Russians time to organize resistance and seek international support. The Battle of Borodino, fought on September 7, 1812, represented Napoleon's last real chance to achieve the decisive victory that would justify the enormous risks of the Russian campaign. Kutuzov had finally decided to make a stand approximately 70 miles west of Moscow, partly because Russian public opinion demanded that the army fight to defend the ancient capital, and partly because he believed the battlefield offered favourable defensive positions. The Russian army took up positions behind earthwork fortifications on a series of low hills, with their flanks protected by forests and streams that would limit French manoeuvrability. Napoleon approached the Battle of Borodino with characteristic confidence, believing that his tactical superiority would enable him to destroy the Russian army despite its strong defensive positions. The Grande Armée that fought at Borodino numbered approximately 130,000 men, still a formidable force despite the losses suffered during the advance into Russia. However, this army was no longer the elite force that had conquered Europe in earlier campaigns. Many of the veterans had been killed or wounded in previous battles, and their replacements were often inexperienced conscripts who lacked the training and motivation of Napoleon's earlier soldiers. The multinational composition of the army also created communication and coordination problems that had not existed when Napoleon commanded primarily French forces. The battle itself was a brutal, grinding affair that lasted from dawn until dusk and resulted in some of the highest casualty rates in military history. Napoleon's usual tactical brilliance seemed to desert him at Borodino, as he ordered a series of frontal assaults against prepared Russian positions rather than attempting the flanking manoeuvres and tactical innovations that had characterized his earlier victories. The French attacks were courageous and determined, but they resulted in enormous casualties without achieving decisive results. Russian soldiers fought with desperate courage, knowing that they were defending their homeland against foreign invaders, and their defensive positions enabled them to inflict heavy losses on attacking French forces. The most famous incident of the battle occurred when Napoleon's Imperial Guard, his elite reserve force, was positioned for a final assault that might have broken Russian resistance. However, Napoleon hesitated to commit his last reserves to the battle, possibly because he was suffering from illness or because he understood that the destruction of the Guard would leave him without any reliable troops for future campaigns. This decision has been debated by military historians for more than 2 centuries, with some arguing that Napoleon missed his last chance for decisive victory, and others contending that committing the Guard would have been a futile gesture that would only have increased French casualties. The aftermath of Borodino demonstrated the limitations of Napoleon's tactical system when faced with an enemy willing to accept enormous casualties rather than admit defeat. The French technically won the battle because the Russians withdrew from the battlefield, but this victory came at a cost that Napoleon could not afford. French casualties numbered approximately 30,000 men, including many experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, whose loss seriously weakened the army's effectiveness. Russian casualties were even higher, totaling perhaps 40,000 men. But the Russian army maintained its cohesion and continued its retreat toward Moscow in good order. More importantly, from a strategic perspective, Borodino failed to achieve any of Napoleon's major objectives for the campaign. The Russian army had not been destroyed, Russian resistance had not been broken, and Tsar Alexander showed no signs of being willing to negotiate a peace settlement. Napoleon had won a tactical victory that brought him no closer to achieving his strategic goals, while the enormous casualties suffered by both sides demonstrated that future battles would be equally costly and indecisive. The French entry into Moscow on September 14, 1812, initially appeared to vindicate Napoleon's strategy and provide the dramatic victory that would force Russia to seek peace. Moscow was Russia's ancient capital, a city of enormous symbolic and emotional significance that had never before been occupied by foreign armies. Napoleon expected that the capture of Moscow would deal a psychological blow to Russian morale comparable to his earlier captures of Vienna, Berlin, and Madrid. The emperor also hoped that Moscow's resources would help solve the supply problems that had plagued his army throughout the campaign. However, Napoleon's triumph quickly turned to disaster when he discovered that Moscow had been largely evacuated by its population, and that fires were breaking out throughout the city. These fires, whether set deliberately by Russian patriots or caused accidentally by the chaos of military occupation, eventually destroyed approximately 3/4 of Moscow's buildings and eliminated most of the food and shelter that Napoleon had expected to find. Instead of providing comfortable winter quarters for the Grande Armée, Moscow became a burned-out shell that offered little protection from the approaching Russian winter. Even more troubling from Napoleon's perspective was the complete absence of any Russian peace overtures following the fall of Moscow. In previous campaigns, the capture of enemy capitals had typically led to immediate negotiations and peace settlements favourable to France. Austrian and Prussian resistance had collapsed quickly after Napoleon occupied Vienna and Berlin, but Russian determination seemed only to be strengthened by the loss of Moscow. Tsar Alexander issued proclamations declaring that Russia would never make peace with Napoleon and that the war would continue until the last French soldier had been driven from Russian soil. Napoleon spent 5 weeks in Moscow waiting for Russian peace proposals that never came, while his military situation deteriorated steadily. The Grande Armée continued to suffer losses from disease and desertion, while Russian irregular forces and Cossack cavalry units harassed French supply lines and isolated detachments. Winter weather was approaching rapidly, and Napoleon understood that his army would not be able to survive a Russian winter campaign without adequate supplies and shelter. By mid-October, it became clear that the emperor faced a choice between beginning an immediate retreat or risking the complete destruction of his army. The decision to retreat from Moscow, made on October 19, 1812, marked the beginning of one of the most famous military disasters in history. Napoleon initially hoped to conduct an orderly withdrawal that would preserve most of his army and allow him to establish defensive positions in Poland or East Prussia. However, a combination of weather, logistics, enemy harassment and declining morale transformed the retreat into a catastrophic rout that destroyed the Grande Armée as an effective fighting force. The retreat began badly when Napoleon chose to march southwest toward Kaluga rather than retracing his route through Smolensk, apparently hoping to find better supplies and avoid the devastated areas through which the army had advanced. This decision led to another battle at Maloyaroslavets on October 24th, where Russian forces blocked the French advance and forced Napoleon to abandon his plan for an alternative route. The delay caused by this battle cost the French several precious days of good weather and forced them to begin the long march back through territory that had already been stripped of supplies. November 1812 brought early winter weather that caught the retreating French army completely unprepared for the extreme cold of the Russian climate. Temperatures dropped far below what most European soldiers had ever experienced, and the army lacked adequate winter clothing, shelter, and food supplies necessary for cold weather operations. Soldiers began dying from exposure, frostbite, and starvation as the retreat became increasingly disorganized and desperate. Discipline broke down as units became separated and individual soldiers focused on personal survival rather than military cohesion. The crossing of the Berezina River on November 26, 1812, became the most famous episode of the retreat and demonstrated both the courage of French soldiers and the complete breakdown of military organization. Russian forces had destroyed the bridges across the river and positioned artillery to prevent French forces from crossing at the obvious fording points. However, French engineers managed to construct makeshift bridges under enemy fire, and the army began a chaotic evacuation that lasted 3 days and nights. Thousands of soldiers and civilians died during the crossing, either from enemy fire, drowning, or exposure to the extreme cold. Napoleon himself abandoned the army on December 5, 1812, leaving Marshal Joachim Murat in command while he raced back to Paris to deal with political crises and begin organizing new armies. The emperor's departure was kept secret to prevent complete collapse of morale, but his absence removed the one leader who might have been able to maintain some semblance of military discipline during the final stages of the retreat. By December 1812, the remnants of the Grande Armée had crossed the Niemen River back into friendly territory, but fewer than 40,000 effective soldiers remained from the 600,000 men who had begun the campaign 6 months earlier. The military lessons of the Russian campaign were profound and would influence military thinking for generations to come. Napoleon's defeat demonstrated the dangers of overextending supply lines and the importance of logistical planning in military operations. The campaign also showed how climate and geography could be decisive factors in warfare, particularly when combined with enemy strategies designed to exploit these natural advantages. The failure of the Russian campaign revealed the limitations of Napoleonic tactical methods when applied to vast distances and unconventional warfare, and it demonstrated that even military genius could not overcome impossible strategic situations. The Russian campaign also highlighted the importance of military resilience and strategic depth in national defense. Russia's ability to absorb enormous losses while maintaining military cohesion and continuing resistance showed that wars could not always be won through brilliant tactics and quick, decisive battles. The campaign demonstrated that sometimes the stronger strategic position belonged to the defender, who could trade space for time and use geographic advantages to negate enemy tactical superiority. From a logistical perspective, the Russian campaign became a classic case study in the importance of supply line security and the limitations of living off the land. Military historians have calculated that Napoleon would have needed approximately 50,000 supply wagons to adequately support his army throughout the campaign, a number that would have made rapid movement impossible and created enormous additional logistical burdens. The campaign showed that there were practical limits to the size of armies that could be effectively supplied and controlled over long distances with early 19th century technology. The psychological impact of the Russian disaster extended far beyond the immediate military consequences and fundamentally altered the balance of power in Europe. Napoleon's reputation for invincibility was permanently shattered, encouraging his enemies to form new coalitions and inspiring resistance movements throughout the French Empire. The massive casualties suffered by French and Allied forces weakened Napoleon's military resources and made it impossible for him to maintain his dominant position in European affairs. Perhaps most importantly, the Russian campaign demonstrated that Napoleon was not the military genius his propaganda had claimed, but rather a talented but fallible human being whose mistakes could have catastrophic consequences. Chapter 11. The German Liberation, 1813. The War of the Sixth Coalition. The year 1813 marked a turning point in Napoleon's career, when the very foundations of his European empire began to crumble like a house built on sand. After the catastrophic retreat from Moscow, where hundreds of thousands of his soldiers had perished in the brutal Russian winter, Napoleon found himself facing not just one enemy, but an entire continent united against him. The disaster in Russia had shown Europe that the seemingly invincible French emperor was not a god of war after all, but a mortal man whose armies could be defeated and destroyed. The first crack in Napoleon's empire came from an unexpected source: Prussia, his former ally who had been forced into submission after the humiliating defeat at Jena-Auerstedt 7 years earlier. King Frederick William III of Prussia had watched in silence as Napoleon dragged his country into the disastrous Russian campaign, forcing Prussian soldiers to march alongside the French into the frozen wasteland. When news of the Grande Armée's destruction reached Berlin, the Prussian court erupted in excitement. General Gerhard von Scharnhorst and other military reformers who had spent years rebuilding the Prussian army in secret now saw their chance for revenge. On February 28, 1813, Prussia signed the Treaty of Kalisz with Russia, formally breaking its alliance with France and joining the coalition against Napoleon. But this was more than just another diplomatic alliance between kings and emperors. The Prussian defection sparked something entirely new in European history: the birth of German nationalism. For the first time, ordinary German people began to think of themselves not just as subjects of various princes and kings, but as members of a single German nation that had been oppressed by French domination. Across the German states, poets and writers began composing stirring verses, calling for liberation from the foreign yoke. Students and intellectuals formed volunteer units, dreaming of a united Germany free from French control. The philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte gave passionate speeches in Berlin, declaring that the time had come for the German people to rise up and reclaim their destiny. This was no longer just a war between monarchs fighting over territory and trade routes, but a people's war for national independence. Austria, the ancient rival of France, watched these developments with growing interest. Emperor Francis I and his cunning foreign minister, Prince Metternich, had been playing a careful game of diplomatic chess, maintaining an uneasy alliance with Napoleon while secretly preparing for war. Metternich was one of the most skilled diplomats of his age, a man who could smile pleasantly while planning your destruction. He understood that Austria's survival depended on choosing the right moment to strike. The Habsburg Empire had suffered humiliating defeats at Napoleon's hands at Austerlitz, Wagram, and other battles, losing territory, prestige, and millions of subjects. Now, with Napoleon weakened and facing enemies on multiple fronts, Metternich saw the perfect opportunity for revenge. Austria began secret negotiations with the coalition while publicly maintaining its alliance with France, a masterpiece of diplomatic deception that would have made Machiavelli proud. From the north came another unexpected enemy, Sweden, now ruled by one of Napoleon's own former marshals. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte had been chosen as heir to the Swedish throne in 1810, a decision that seemed to strengthen Napoleon's position in northern Europe. But Bernadotte proved to be an ungrateful protégé who quickly turned against his former master. As Crown Prince of Sweden, Bernadotte had his own ambitions and understood that his new country's interests lay with the coalition rather than with France. Sweden wanted to acquire Norway from Denmark, Napoleon's ally, and saw the war as an opportunity to expand Swedish territory. Bernadotte brought valuable military expertise to the coalition, having learned Napoleon's tactics firsthand during years of service in the French army. He understood better than most Allied commanders how Napoleon thought and fought, making him a dangerous enemy who could anticipate the emperor's moves. Meanwhile, Tsar Alexander I of Russia refused to make peace despite Napoleon's desperate diplomatic overtures. The Russian emperor had been transformed by the events of 1812 from a sometimes ally into an implacable enemy, determined to pursue Napoleon to the gates of Paris if necessary. Alexander saw himself as the liberator of Europe, divinely appointed to free the continent from French tyranny. Russian armies poured westward into Poland and Prussia, carrying with them not just military supplies, but also printing presses that churned out proclamations calling on all Europeans to rise against Napoleon. The Tsar's forces were still formidable despite their losses in the previous year's campaign, and they brought with them battle-hardened veterans who had learned to fight the French army and win. Napoleon faced this growing coalition with characteristic energy and determination, but also with resources stretched to the breaking point. The Grande Armée that had marched into Russia was gone forever, destroyed by battle, disease, and the merciless winter. Now the emperor faced the monumental task of creating a new army almost from nothing, while his enemies grew stronger with each passing day. In a display of organizational genius that rivaled his greatest military achievements, Napoleon somehow managed to raise and equip over 200,000 new troops in just a few months. These were not the seasoned veterans who had conquered Europe, but mostly teenage conscripts and hastily recalled reservists who had barely learned to march in formation, let alone fight a battle. The new French army was like a sword made of inferior metal. It might look impressive, but it would shatter under the strain of serious combat. Many of the new soldiers were so young they were called Marie-Louise, after Napoleon's young Austrian wife, a cruel joke that highlighted their inexperience. The emperor worked tirelessly to train these raw recruits, but there was no substitute for the years of campaigning that had made his old soldiers the finest infantry in Europe. Even more problematic was the critical shortage of cavalry, the mounted arm that had given Napoleon's armies their decisive advantage in so many battles. Horses were expensive and took years to train properly, and Napoleon simply did not have the time or resources to rebuild his cavalry arm to its former strength. Despite these limitations, Napoleon demonstrated that his military genius remained intact when he opened the spring campaign of 1813 with a series of rapid marches that caught his enemies off guard. Moving with the speed that had always been his trademark, the emperor concentrated his forces in central Germany and struck at the Allied armies before they could unite their superior numbers against him. At Lutzen on May 2nd, 1813, Napoleon's young soldiers proved they could fight like veterans when properly led, defeating a combined Prussian-Russian army in a hard-fought battle that echoed with the sound of musket volleys and the clash of bayonets. The French attack was so fierce and determined that the Allies were forced to retreat, leaving the battlefield littered with their dead and wounded. 3 weeks later, at Bautzen, Napoleon again demonstrated his tactical superiority by outmanoeuvring a larger Allied force and winning another victory, that sent his enemies reeling backward. The battle was fought across rolling hills and through burning villages, with both sides displaying tremendous courage and determination. French artillery, still the finest in Europe, tore gaps in the Allied lines, while Napoleon's infantry advanced with the precision of a well-oiled machine. For a moment it seemed as though the old magic had returned, and Napoleon might once again snatch victory from the jaws of defeat through sheer military brilliance. But these victories were hollow triumphs that brought Napoleon no closer to ending the war on favourable terms. Without adequate cavalry to pursue the defeated enemies, the French could not turn tactical victories into strategic success. After each battle, the Allied armies simply withdrew in good order, ready to fight another day. This was the fundamental weakness that would plague Napoleon throughout the 1813 campaign. He could still win battles, but he could no longer win wars. The enemy had learned from years of defeats to avoid decisive engagements where Napoleon's tactical genius could destroy them in a single day. Instead, they would retreat when faced with superior force, then return to attack isolated French detachments and vulnerable supply lines. Napoleon's enemies had also learned the value of patience, something that had always been foreign to the emperor's nature. In June 1813, both sides agreed to an armistice that supposedly gave them time to negotiate a peaceful settlement. But while Napoleon genuinely hoped to use the truce to consolidate his gains and perhaps split the coalition through diplomacy, his enemies used the breathing space to strengthen their alliance and bring fresh troops to the front. Austria used the armistice period to complete its preparations for war, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of additional soldiers while maintaining the pretense of neutrality. Britain poured gold into coalition coffers, subsidizing the war effort and ensuring that Napoleon's enemies would have the financial resources for a long campaign. This armistice was one of Napoleon's greatest strategic errors, a mistake that would ultimately cost him his empire. By agreeing to halt military operations when he held the initiative, Napoleon gave his enemies time to recover from their defeats and coordinate their strategy. A Napoleon, at the height of his powers, would never have made such a blunder, but the Emperor of 1813 was no longer the young general who had conquered Italy or the master strategist who had crushed the Austrians at Austerlitz. The years of constant warfare had taken their toll, and Napoleon was beginning to make the kind of mistakes that would have been unthinkable in his earlier campaigns. When fighting resumed in August 1813, Napoleon found himself facing a fundamentally different kind of war. The coalition had developed what became known as the Trachenberg Plan, a strategy so simple and effective that it would serve as a model for future alliance warfare. The plan was brutally straightforward: avoid battle with Napoleon himself at all costs, but attack his subordinate commanders whenever possible. The Allies had learned through bitter experience that Napoleon was still nearly invincible when he personally commanded an army, but his marshals were mortal men who could be defeated by superior numbers and careful planning. This strategy played to the coalition's greatest strength, overwhelming numerical superiority. By the autumn of 1813, the Allies could field over 500,000 soldiers against Napoleon's 400,000, and more importantly, they could afford to lose battles while Napoleon could not. Every French defeat weakened the Emperor's position, while Allied losses could be quickly replaced by fresh reserves. It was a war of attrition that Napoleon was destined to lose, no matter how brilliantly he fought individual battles. Napoleon's last great victory came at Dresden on August 27, 1813, where he once again demonstrated the tactical brilliance that had made him master of Europe. Attacking an Austrian army in the pouring rain, Napoleon's forces broke through the enemy lines and sent them fleeing in disorder. The battle was fought in terrible conditions, with soldiers slipping and sliding in the mud, while artillery pieces sank up to their axles in the soggy ground. But Napoleon's troops, inspired by their emperor's presence, fought with a determination that overcame all obstacles. French cavalry charged through streets turned into rivers by the driving rain, while infantry advanced with bayonets fixed against Austrian positions that seemed impregnable. Yet even this victory could not change the fundamental strategic situation. While Napoleon was winning at Dresden, his marshals were suffering defeats elsewhere that more than cancelled out his success. At Katzbach, Marshal MacDonald's army was crushed by Prussian forces led by the elderly but still capable General Blücher. At Kulm, General Van Damme's corps was surrounded and destroyed while trying to pursue the retreating Austrians. At Dennewitz, Marshal Ney was defeated by a combined Prussian-Swedish army under Bernadotte. Each of these defeats cost Napoleon thousands of irreplaceable veterans and further weakened his strategic position. The climax of the German campaign came in October 1813 with the Battle of Leipzig, a massive confrontation that would earn the nickname Battle of the Nations because it involved soldiers from virtually every European country. Leipzig was not just a battle, but a series of interconnected engagements fought over 4 days across a battlefield that stretched for miles around the Saxon city. Never before in European history had so many soldiers gathered in one place for a single battle. Over 600,000 men carrying weapons that would determine the fate of the continent. Napoleon faced impossible odds at Leipzig, outnumbered by nearly 2-1 and fighting enemies who were attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. To the north, Bernadotte's Swedes and Germans advanced across flat fields made muddy by autumn rains. From the east came the Russians, their white uniforms stained with the dust of long marches, but their spirits high with the prospect of victory. Austrian forces approached from the south, while Prussian armies pressed forward from the west, their black uniforms earning them the nickname Black Death among French soldiers. The battle began on October 16th with a series of probing attacks as both sides tested their enemies' strength and dispositions. Napoleon, despite being heavily outnumbered, showed no signs of backing down from the fight. His army was positioned in a rough circle around Leipzig, a formation that allowed him to shift troops quickly to threatened sectors, but also meant he was essentially trapped with his back to the city. The Emperor spent the first day of battle riding from one crisis point to another, his presence inspiring French soldiers to superhuman efforts against overwhelming odds. On October 17th, both sides paused to reorganize and bring up reinforcements, but the strategic situation only grew worse for Napoleon as more Allied troops arrived on the battlefield. The French Emperor now faced the largest army ever assembled against him, a multinational force that represented the united will of Europe to end French domination. Yet Napoleon refused to retreat, perhaps believing that one decisive victory could still save his empire, or perhaps simply unable to accept that his military genius had finally met its match. The decisive fighting came on October 18th, when the Allies launched coordinated attacks from all directions simultaneously. The battle raged across villages, farms and open fields, with neither side giving quarter. French artillery, concentrated in massive batteries, tore bloody gaps in the advancing Allied columns, while coalition cavalry charged again and again at French infantry squares that bristled with bayonets. The sound of the battle could be heard 20 miles away, a continuous thunder of cannon fire punctuated by the rattle of musketry, and the screams of wounded men and horses. Napoleon's tactical skill was still evident in how he managed his outnumbered forces, shifting troops from quiet sectors to threatened points and launching counterattacks that temporarily stabilized his crumbling lines. French infantry, many of them still teenagers, fought with a courage that impressed even their enemies. Time and again, they repulsed Allied attacks through sheer determination and superior training. Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave, seemed to be everywhere at once, rallying broken units and leading desperate charges that temporarily restored the French position. But numbers began to tell as the day wore on. Fresh Allied reserves continued to arrive on the battlefield, while Napoleon's forces grew progressively weaker from constant combat. Worse still, Napoleon's German allies began to defect during the battle itself, entire Saxon regiments switching sides and opening gaps in the French lines that Allied forces quickly exploited. The defection of the Saxons was a devastating blow, both militarily and psychologically, showing that even Napoleon's most loyal allies had lost faith in his ability to win the war. By evening on October 18th, Napoleon realized that his position was hopeless. His army had fought magnificently, but could not overcome odds of 2-1 while surrounded on all sides. The Emperor faced the most difficult decision of his military career. Order a retreat that would mean abandoning his empire, or continue fighting and risk the destruction of his entire army. With characteristic decisiveness, Napoleon chose survival over glory and ordered a withdrawal toward France. The retreat from Leipzig was a masterpiece of military organization under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. Napoleon had to extract his army from a trap, while under constant attack from enemies who smelled victory and pressed forward with renewed energy. The French withdrawal was conducted primarily at night, with entire divisions marching in darkness, while rear guards fought desperate actions to slow the Allied pursuit. The single bridge across the Elster River became a crucial bottleneck, with thousands of soldiers crowding toward the narrow crossing, while enemy artillery shells burst among them. Tragedy struck during the final phase of the retreat when a nervous French engineer prematurely destroyed the Elster Bridge, trapping thousands of soldiers on the wrong side of the river. Marshal Poniatowski, Napoleon's loyal Polish ally, drowned while trying to swim the river in full armour, becoming one of the last casualties of the battle. The premature destruction of the bridge was a catastrophe that cost Napoleon an entire corps and left a bitter taste that would haunt the survivors for years to come. The collapse of Leipzig had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military disaster. The Confederation of the Rhine, Napoleon's puppet organization of German states, disintegrated overnight as princes and kings scrambled to join the winning side. Kingdoms that had been loyal French allies for years suddenly discovered their ancient friendship with Austria and Prussia. The speed with which Napoleon's German allies abandoned him was breathtaking and showed how shallow their loyalty had always been. More importantly, the Battle of Leipzig marked the birth of German nationalism as a political force that would reshape European history. German soldiers who had fought side by side against the French began to dream of political unity to match their military cooperation. Students and intellectuals who had volunteered for the war against Napoleon carried home ideas about German identity and national destiny that would eventually lead to German unification decades later. The War of Liberation, as Germans called the 1813 campaign, became a founding myth of modern German nationalism. Napoleon's retreat to France was conducted with the same energy and skill that had characterized his earlier campaigns, But now he was fighting a defensive war for which his aggressive temperament was poorly suited. The Rhine River, Europe's most formidable natural barrier, should have provided an excellent defensive line where Napoleon could concentrate his remaining forces and negotiate from a position of strength. But the emperor's enemies were no longer interested in negotiation. They had tasted victory at Leipzig and wanted nothing less than Napoleon's complete destruction. The Continental System, Napoleon's economic weapon against Britain, collapsed along with his military empire. European ports that had been closed to British trade for years suddenly reopened, and British goods flooded back into continental markets. The economic warfare that had been one of Napoleon's most effective weapons turned into a tool for his enemies as European merchants rushed to resume their profitable trade with Britain. The Royal Navy, which had been blockaded from European waters, once again became master of the seas and could support the coalition with both supplies and gold. Perhaps most damaging of all was Napoleon's refusal to accept a reasonable peace settlement when it was still possible. The Allies, somewhat surprisingly, offered to allow Napoleon to remain Emperor of France within its natural boundaries, which would have left him ruling one of Europe's most powerful nations. But Napoleon's pride would not accept what he saw as humiliating terms, and he continued fighting in the desperate hope that one more great victory might restore his fortunes. This was perhaps Napoleon's greatest character flaw, his inability to know when to stop, to accept limitations, and to cut his losses while he still could. The coordination of coalition warfare at Leipzig provided important lessons that would influence military thinking for generations to come. Never before had armies from so many different nations worked together so effectively on a single battlefield. Russian, Prussian, Austrian and Swedish forces, each with their own languages, traditions and methods of fighting, somehow managed to coordinate their attacks and achieve their objectives. This was a remarkable achievement that required extensive planning, clear communication, and mutual trust between commanders who had been enemies just years before. The key to successful coalition warfare at Leipzig was the establishment of a unified command structure that respected national sensitivities while maintaining strategic coherence. Tsar Alexander I served as the nominal supreme commander, but actual operational control was exercised by a council of war that included representatives from all the major allies. This arrangement was clumsy and sometimes led to delays and confusion, but it ensured that no single nation dominated the others and that all allies remained committed to the common cause. Communication between the various national contingents was facilitated by a common educated class that spoke French, ironically the language of their enemy. Staff officers from different armies could coordinate their movements and share intelligence because they all understood the military terminology and concepts that had become standardized across Europe during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Maps, reports and orders could be translated quickly and accurately, ensuring that complex battle plans could be executed by multinational forces. The Allies had also learned valuable lessons from their earlier defeats at Napoleon's hands. They understood that French tactical superiority could be overcome by strategic patience and numerical superiority. Rather than seeking decisive battles where Napoleon's genius could destroy them, the coalition forces focused on wearing down French strength through continuous pressure and avoiding major risks. This was an early example of what would later be called total war, where entire nations, rather than just armies, were committed to achieving victory. The Battle of Leipzig also demonstrated how modern warfare was becoming increasingly dependent on industrial capacity and economic resources. The coalition's victory was made possible not just by superior numbers of soldiers, but by superior production of weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and other military supplies. Britain's Industrial Revolution had given the Allies access to manufactured goods that the French could no longer match, while the Royal Navy's control of the seas ensured that these supplies could reach Allied armies, while French forces went without. Looking back on the German liberation campaign of 1813, we can see it as the moment when Napoleon's military genius finally met its match, not in another great general, but in the collective will and resources of an entire continent united against him. The Emperor's tactical brilliance remained intact, as shown by his victories at Lutzen, Bautzen and Dresden, but individual genius could no longer overcome the strategic disadvantages created by years of conquest and oppression. Europe had learned to fight Napoleon by copying his methods while avoiding his strengths, and the result was inevitable once the coalition maintained its unity and resolve. The campaign also marked the emergence of nationalism as a dominant force in European politics. The German people's fight for liberation from French rule created a sense of shared identity that transcended the traditional boundaries of kingdoms and principalities. This nationalist awakening would have profound consequences for European history, eventually leading to German unification and the creation of the German Empire that would dominate Central Europe for the next century. For Napoleon himself, the defeat at Leipzig was the beginning of the end. He had lost not just a battle or even a campaign, but the foundation of his entire imperial system. The satellite kingdoms and puppet states that had extended French power across Europe were crumbling, and even his most loyal allies were beginning to question whether association with the Emperor was worth the cost. The retreat to France was more than a military withdrawal. It was the collapse of a dream of European unity under French leadership that had driven Napoleon's ambitions for over a decade. Yet even in defeat, Napoleon's military genius remained evident in how he conducted the retreat and managed to preserve a substantial portion of his army for future campaigns. The Emperor, who had marched into Germany with high hopes of crushing his enemies and restoring his empire, was now fighting for his political survival. But he was still Napoleon Bonaparte, and he was not yet ready to surrender. The final act of his imperial drama would be played out on French soil, where the master of warfare would make his last stand against the united forces of Europe that he had once dominated with such ease and brilliance.